Novak was recruited by the University of Toronto in 1997 to be the first J. Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair of Jewish Studies, a position he continues to hold as a professor in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center for Jewish Studies. He came to Toronto from the University of Virginia, where he was the first Edgar Bronfman Professor of Modern Judaica Studies from 1989 to 1997. And prior to that, he taught at the University, Oklahoma City University, Old Dominion University, the New School for Social Research, Jewish Theological Seminary, and Baruch College, and served for 3 years as Jewish chaplain to St. Elizabeth's, the historic psychiatric hospital in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, throughout those years, from 1966 to 89, he served as rabbi of a number of U.S. congregations. David earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago, master's and rabbinical degree and rabbinical diploma from Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and his PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. Well, it's impossible, of course, to list the many honors and awards, visiting professorships, and the like that he's received over a long, distinguished, and varied career. But just a couple of examples: he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a consulting scholar of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton, where he was also a distinguished visiting scholar and then a visiting professor of religion. He was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's founder and I believe now president of the Union for Traditional Judaism. David has lectured throughout North America, Europe, South Africa, Israel, and been a consultant to the governments of the United States, Israel, and Poland, and to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. His research interests: ethics, Jewish philosophy, the philosophy of religion, political theory with an emphasis on natural law, Jewish-Christian relations, reflected in 19 books authored and hundreds of articles, reviews, presentations, and so forth. Well, to name only a couple of his books: Covenantal Rights, a study of Jewish political theory, published by Princeton, which won the American Academy of Religion Award for the best book in constructive religious thought in 2000. There was Natural Law, a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic trialogue, co-authored with Enver Eman and Matthew Levering, published by Oxford in 2014. Zionism and Judaism, Cambridge, 2015, has been described as, quote, a book which seeks to provide a philosophical answer to the questions: why should anyone be a Zionist, a supporter of a Jewish state in the land of Israel? Why should there be a Jewish state in the land of Israel? And then Athens and Jerusalem, God, Humans, and Nature, which is a book based on his 2017 Gifford Lectures at the University of Aberdeen, published by Toronto, argues that tensions between Jewish and Christian doctrine may be lessened if texts are regarded as philosophical frameworks of explanation as opposed to ethical commitments. David is one of 4 co-authors of Dabru Emet, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity, which was endorsed by more than 200 Jewish scholars, aiming to foster Jewish-Christian relations. First published famously in the New York Times in 2000, and now translated into at least 8 languages. Well, besides his own writings, he is the subject of 6 books, from Tradition in the Public Square, a David Novak reader, to 2008, to Jewish-Christian Dialogue in the Life of Wisdom, Engagements with the Theology of David Novak, and as recently as 2021, The Achievement of David Novak, a Catholic-Jewish Dialogue. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome David to the Senior College virtual podium, and his topic: the new world of Jewish-Christian relations. David. Unmute. David, you must unmute yourself.
Thank you, Linda, for that fulsome introduction, which I very much appreciate. And I'm very happy to be here with Senior College, whose existence I didn't even know of until Linda invited me to make a presentation today. And as somebody who's now in the process of kind of negotiating my own retirement, I asked Linda Hutcheon, how does one, do you have to be elected or can you become a member? And she indicated that it's ipso facto upon retirement. So I really look forward to being a part of this group, which, as I say, I didn't learn of until I was invited to speak to it. But there is not only a pleasure in the present, but an anticipation of a future relationship. The new world of Jewish-Christian relations. And in order to understand the new world of Jewish-Christian relations, one has to understand what the old world of Jewish Christian relations was. And why there is a decided difference, certainly beginning in the latter part of the 20th century. There are various models that one can use in terms of describing, analyzing, and judging this relationship of 2,000 years. But the one that I would like to employ today is to look upon Judaism and Christianity as naming the ideology, if you will, of two separate communities that were once part of the same community. And looking at this through a theological political lens. My theological political meaning that first of all, they cannot be understood without both communities constituting what they consider to be a relationship with God and deriving their legitimacy from God. Now, granted, there are those in both the Jewish and Christian communities who've said that Jews and Christians basically worship different gods. I'm of the party that says they're worshiping the same God, although at times in very different ways and sometimes very similar ways. The political is that these are religions that are not individual preferences or whatever, like one becoming, for example, an Aristotelian or a Kantian in philosophy, but that these are communal entities that where the theological and the political overlap. And therefore one has to understand the political interactions of these two communities in both respects, how it overlaps with the theological aspect of their existence. And when one talks about politics, one talks about power. One talks about political power and the power relationship between Jews and Christians, between the Jewish community and the church, the Christian church, is one that one has to understand the shifting templates. And if one understands the shifting templates, then one can understand why, since the latter part of the 20th century, there is a different constellation of the power relations between these two communities. So I'm going to, in a very general sort of way, I hope it's not superficial, but in a sort of general way, begin at the beginning. Christianity begins as a Jewish sect. It begins as a Jewish sect in a particular form of Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism. That always surprises people. Jesus has some very harsh things to say about the Pharisees, but it's an interfamilial dispute. And anybody who's known interfamilial disputes, they get hot and heavy as opposed to arguing with strangers. So it begins as a Jewish Pharisaic sect, which affirms that Jesus of Nazareth is the promised Messiah, the promised Redeemer of the Jewish people, and by extension, the entire world, but primarily the promised Redeemer of the Jewish people. Now, this notion of messianism is a very apocalyptic messianism. It is clearly supernatural. It is not the Messiah king, the anointed king. That's what Messiah means, Mashiach, of biblical times, where you have an ordinary king, even though chosen by God. This is quite apocalyptic. And that is the theological difference, is that the Jesus community, or which already calls itself the ecclesia, or the church, which is the equivalent of Knesset, Israel, the synagogue as an institution as opposed to a building, is that the difference is, this is the theological difference. This is the theological difference. But when one looks at theological differences, this would not have been sufficient if it were just a question of, has the Messiah come or not? This would not have been sufficient for these communities to separate as two distinct political entities. What brought it about was the decision on the part of both communities already in the 2nd century that one could not be a member of both communities, that one had to make one's choice of which community one was in. And that was distinct from an earlier, the Church of Jerusalem, for example, that still wanted to regard the church as basically a Jewish sect. Now, that took two forms. Number one, the form that is mentioned in the New Testament already in the book of Acts, is the question of proselytization. Jews, this always surprises people, certainly in the ancient world, were not only active proselytizers, they were the first proselytizers, because one could literally be born again into the Jewish community in a way that one could not be born again into a number of the ethnic religions that had been there. So that therefore the question of bringing people into the community, which means extending the power and authority of the community, was something that clearly had to be distinct. And of course, the requirement of circumcision, the requirement of accepting all the Jewish commandments, was no longer required by the Christian community. So in fact, the Christian community was taking in people whom the other Jews would not regard as legitimate converts. So that is the one area where the two communities are splitting. The other area, which comes later, is what was called Judaization. The church very early was critical of basically Jews who had become Christians who were still practicing Judaism. And they considered this to be actually a sin of Judaization. They were supposed to no longer regard themselves as part of the Jewish community and participating in Jewish communal rituals. On the Jewish side of the ledger, there was also a prohibition of Judaization, that is, Gentiles who had not converted to Judaism, nevertheless practicing Jewish rituals and Jewish communal rituals and whatever. So both sides, in terms of this split, was saying that you cannot live under the authority of another community. Our authority, you're living under the authority of our community. Therefore, it means that that is an exclusive covenantal relationship, and it is different. Christianity is no longer a Jewish sect, and Judaism is not something which is simply a preparation for Christianity. Now, both of them, however, are living under Roman imperial rule. And Roman imperial rule is willing to tolerate both communities, provided that they make no ultimate political claims, that they make no political claims of a Messiah that is basically going to threaten the authority of Caesar. And therefore, understanding that, therefore, this was something that at times was rebelled against by both, but was primarily by the late 2nd century, was something that was accepted by both communities. We're living under Roman rule, and as long as we don't challenge their overall political authority, we can be what Spinoza called imperium in imperio, an empire within an empire. And at that point, the main interaction of the Jewish and Christian communities was basically seeking proselytes, going after people to join their community. And there was a neck and neck competition. Because there were many pagans out there who had, for a variety of reasons, given up their local cults, as it were, who, by the way, were found primarily coming to synagogues, because the synagogue was the first institution in the ancient world that did not require non-members of the community to not be in the same room with the others. In the temple in Jerusalem, there was the court of the Gentiles. I mean, they were welcomed there, but they in no way even mingled with the other worshipers. So that therefore there's this competition for bringing people into either your community or that community. But it's your community or their community is a fundamental difference. And already both communities are indicating that you have to make up your mind which one that you are coming into, because we can't have any kind of joint authority over people. And this becomes the situation until the famous Edict of Milan in 313, where Constantine not only recognizes the legitimacy of Christianity, because Christianity's legitimacy was somewhat questioned because it was considered to be a new religion, where Jews were considered to be an ancient religion. But by that time, it is the toleration of Christianity, also the toleration of Judaism, with one exception. And here's where the power grid changes, is Christians are not only accepted, but they are allowed and even encouraged to proselytize, whereas Jews are prohibited from proselytizing. That already changes the power, because if you cannot bring new people into the community, in effect, you become an ethnic enclave, whereas the church is now claiming to be Catholic, katoholos, that is universal and whatever. So the emperor and the empire permits Christian proselytizing and prohibits Jewish proselytizing. So already Christianity is becoming, in effect, the effective official religion of the Roman Empire, which was always expanding in terms of regarding people as either having some subservient status or actually making people into Roman citizens. So that, for example, in the ancient world, diaspora Jews, not Jews living in the land of Israel or Palestine, because they were living in a military district, but Paul, who was a diaspora Jew, is a Roman citizen. He can go to any court and demand, he can say, Cibus Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen, therefore I require to be judged according to jus civili, according to Roman civil law, like any other Roman citizen. So once that becomes the official religion, then Jews become a tolerated minority, as distinct from the ever-growing Christian majority that can be proactive rather than much more passive. That changes the whole power structure. Now, in late antiquity, going into even the early Middle Ages, the primary concern of Roman endorsed Christianity is basically the Christianization of pagan Europe. And at that point, the Christianization of pagan Europe, for the large extent, Jews are pretty much left alone, as long as they don't attempt to compete with the church. They're pretty much left alone because the church is busy with the Christianization of pagan Europe. Now, when one comes into the late Middle Ages, following, let's say, the Second Crusade, is the paganism, the Christianization of pagan Europe is primarily accomplished. And therefore, there is a notion there of we've Christianized the empire, we've Christianized the ecumene, we've Christianized the civilized world. Who are the holdouts? What is wrong with the Jews? Why are they not going along? Why aren't they giving up their ancestral exclusivity like these other people have given it up? And therefore, the church becomes more and more anti-Jewish, either through persecution or, for example, was the case in France, late medieval France, forcing Jews to listen to conversionist sermons, which had very little effect, by the way, like most sermons. I say that as somebody who's a preacher for many years. But this kind of reaches its epitome in 1492, we're fast forwarding, in 1492, with the Reconquest of Spain, the driving out of both the Jews and the Muslims by the combined monarchy of Ferdinand and Isabella. And in that way, this was considered to be a traumatic event, especially for Jews, because it meant that they were no longer even a tolerated minority in the most prosperous, advanced society in terms of Spain. Just as an aside, at that point, I remember discussing with my Shia Muslim colleague at the University of Virginia, who's still a close friend of mine, Abdulaziz Sashadina. This was a number of years ago. A rumor was going around that the Catholic Church was planning on canonizing Queen Isabella. And I said to Aziz, I said, if they do that, this will do more for Jewish-Muslim relations than solving the Palestinian question, because we have a common enemy. She threw us both out of Spain. So at that point, one reaches what for Jews especially is considered the low point in terms of their presence in post-Roman Christian Europe. Following that, the period of the Reformation is interesting in terms of the relationship with the Jews, because both Protestant and Catholics were accusing each other of Judaization. Each one was accusing the other one of a reversion to Judaism, which already had been outlawed in by the second century. That's a fascinating notion. And I remember once a number of years ago at a conference with the Lutheran theologian Paul Hinlicky, who was saying that at the time of the Reformation, he said, instead of Protestants and Catholics fighting with one another, we should have been talking to the Jews. But that would have been, I mean, that had happened. History may have been different, but of course it wasn't. What we reach now, the date that we should now consider is 1789, the French Revolution, because the French Revolution changes the power situation of both Jews and Christians, and therefore changes their power relations with one another. And it's best expressed by the 1789 statement in the French National Assembly by Count Stanislas Clermont de Tonnerre. Il ne faut pas aux Juifs comme communauté, nothing to the Jews as a community, mais tout aux Juifs comme individus, but everything for Jews as individuals. In other words, people are therefore deprived of, or liberated from, for some people, from their communal identities, And this was as much as destroying the power of the independent Jewish communities, the Kehilot, as it was destroying the power of the church. And therefore, you're considered to be an individual, and whatever communal loyalties you have, whether they're Jewish or Christian, are considered to be under the total control of the state. And the best example of that was Napoleon, who in 1804 convened a quote, Sanhedrin, which was the supreme judicial legislative body of the Jews, basically advocating intermarriage between Jews and Christians as a way of breaking down both their identities. There's a famous instance there where he asked the rabbis, would they recognize a civil marriage between a Jew and a Christian? And the rabbi said, we will recognize it as a civil marriage, which meant that is one thing. And then, of course, this is what the French situation is. You have a civil marriage, and then you go to your church or synagogue or mosque or whatever to get married. But this was the situation where supposedly we're all equal individuals, mais tout juif comme individu, everything is individuals. But what about our communal loyalties of Jews and Christians? And therefore, in effect, these communal loyalties become private associations, except what happens is that this identity, this secular identity, is lacking what Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, called cultural thickness. And at this point, therefore, especially in Protestant Europe, and to a certain extent in Protestantly dominated United States and Canada, was the notion that Christianity supplies what I would call the cultural ethos for a secular logos. In other words, the state is defined secularly. We're all individuals. However, it needs a culture, and Christianity therefore argues that this provides the cultural content for the state. And even this model, even in the United States where I grew up, and it's probably a little bit different here in Canada, the United States, when I was growing up, the ideal American was considered to be a white Protestant male. And even if you weren't white, Protestant, or male, that is something that you aspired to. So Jews were, for example, urged to celebrate Christmas. a very secularized Christmas, to be sure, but we're urged to celebrate it because this is the American way, this is the German way, this is the Dutch way. That this provides, a kind of cultural content. And the Jewish reaction to that was certainly nobody in the Jewish community either thought it was possible or even wanted it as desirable that somehow or other that the state, the secular state, should have a Jewish ethos, a Jewish culture. So generally, the Jewish attitude towards this Christian ascendancy to cultural power was either on the more traditional, which now began calling itself Orthodox, is to be more and more sectarian, just to opt out as much as possible and have as little to do other than for economic and basic political reasons, but not to identify with the culture at all and simply to opt out. Let them have theirs and we will have ours, and hopefully they won't bother us. On the other hand, there is the rise of a Jewish secularism, which says that regards the Christianization, even of the culture, to be something that is threatening to Jews, and therefore we can't opt for our own cultural ascendancy. So therefore we will argue for what some have called the naked public square. In other words, that basically there is to be no religious content, whether Christian or anybody else's, in public. It is something that is strictly private, and we don't want any kind of religious expression in the public realm. And this attitude, which is still an attitude of many Jews, especially of a more liberal type, emerged in a way during the 2000 election in the United States, when Senator Joseph Lieberman, an Orthodox Jew, became the candidate of the Democrats for vice president, and announced that he would not campaign on the Jewish Sabbath. He would not campaign on the Jewish Sabbath. Now, I know a number of Protestant evangelicals who would never have voted for a Democratic candidate, who were so impressed by that they voted for the Democratic ticket because Lieberman was affirming his religious identity. The only objection to this came from the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League, which criticized him for injecting religion into the campaign. In other words, they were opposed, since we're opposed to Christians interjecting their religion, we should be opposed to Jews interjecting their religion at all. And this, interestingly enough, in the more or less Orthodox or traditional Jewish community that I live in, were absolutely horrified. Can you imagine Jews criticizing another Jew for being religiously in a very public sort of way? And that became very much the factor, And therefore, whereas Christianity attempting any kind of cultural ascendancy is regarded with suspicion because they're trying to seize political power by Jews. What has happened beginning in the latter part of the 20th century is that the predominant secular culture, the culture of the universities, the culture of the media, the culture of more and more of the courts and whatever, is not only non-religious, it becomes what is perceived by many people in both the Jewish community and the Christian community as something that is anti-religious. Not only anti-religious, very few people oppose Jews and Christians or Muslims or Hindus, for that matter, for practicing their religion in private. However, what happens when they insist upon certain moral standards, certain moral/political standards on such things as capital punishment, war, abortion, euthanasia, or whatever, that they say is not something that is the imposition of their religion on other people, but is something which is part of the law of God for everybody, uh, uh, what is considered to be a natural law position. And in fact, I wrote a book with Anwar Iman, who's the head of our Islamic Center here at U of T, and Matthew Levering, a Catholic theologian, on how all three of these traditions acknowledge a common morality, which they're not forcing on other people, but which is presupposed by their own traditions. So at that point, therefore, it becomes a discovery of a commonality uh, by both communities, which have realized that to a certain extent, they're not only out of cultural ascendancy, they're considered to be countercultural. They're considered to be countercultural by the centers of what we would call cultural formation, the media, the universities, and the churches. I mean, the universities and the media in that way. So that this becomes the recognition of minimally a common enemy, but also that they are not going to be able to survive as simply private associations. That there has to be a confirmation of a common morality, which is not considered to be I'm ramming somebody's religion down your throat. And this commonality on this issue can be best illustrated by an experience of mine that I had more than once. In the introduction, Linda's introduction, she mentioned that I taught at the University of Virginia. I taught at the University of Virginia for 7.5 very happy years before I came to the University of Toronto for more happy years. And the University of Virginia, we have to understand, the University of Virginia was the first officially secular university in the United States. Founded by Thomas Jefferson. And therefore, this is the South, those evangelicals who prefer to call themselves evangelical conservative Protestants as opposed to Protestants, those evangelicals who come to the University of Virginia are very, very self-selective. They are people who are convinced that they can make it in not only an indifferent cultural climate, but a hostile climate. And that becomes the factor. And in fact, one Protestant evangelical at the University of Virginia, a student, told me that before his parents would allow him to go to the University of Virginia, he had to appear before a board of elders of the church for them to decide whether he could withstand it or whether UVA would do him in. And that was one student. But there were several occasions where students came to me, especially Protestant evangelicals, and one, a Catholic student, and they would pour their hearts out to me, how not only their faith in terms of the theological component, but also their morality, their political, understood in the deepest sense, were not only ridiculed by their fellow students, but also ridiculed by faculty. And how they felt threatened. And as a minority. And Christians are still going through a traumatic experience of discovering that they are not the majority culture. They are not they've lost virtually most of their cultural power. And that is a traumatic. Jews are a little better off because we never had that power. So that they would come to me and pour their hearts out. And after about a half hour, when I could get in a word edgewise, I would say to them, you sound like Jews. I would say to them, you sound like Jews. And they would say, we feel like Jews. Now, they were not interested in conversion to Judaism, but they were interested in the fact of how Jews have survived, not by a sectarian option, but not by the assimilationist option of simply endorsing everything that is the cultural status quo in league with the political power. And that indicates the new relationship. Now, the new relationship there and in its political side has a danger signal. And the danger signal is the total identification with whatever political power or political party it is that seems to offer you protection. So the uncritical endorsement by many evangelicals and traditionalist Catholics and Orthodox Jews of the Republican Party, or the uncritical endorsement in the United States of the Democratic Party, a little bit different here in Canada, but in terms of that, this uncritical notion, because the theological, political constellation of both communities indicates that the theological perspective of the law of God is something which should form at times a prophetic critique of power, even the power of one's own community, let alone the power of others whom we live under. So that becomes the politicization of where politicians usurp the fears of threatened Jewish and Christian communities for their own purposes. But the even political playing field where Christians who are at all cognizant no longer regard themselves as culturally more powerful than Jews. And Jews no longer have to regard themselves as subservient or deferential to a Christian ethos which really doesn't exist any longer. That is the new world, with its opportunities and with its temptations. And this is something that I have been involved in ever since my late revered theological mentor, Abraham Joshua Heschel, went to Rome in the 1960s and had a direct influence on the position of the Catholic Church regarding Jews and Judaism, which was a time when heretofore Jewish-Christian relations, at least from the Jewish side, but for the Christian side as well, were handled by diplomats. And this was the first time that a really heavyweight theologian was sent in, and that had a tremendous influence in terms of the theological political constellation of the Jewish-Christian relationship. So that's what some thoughts I have to offer today.
Wonderful.